All right, y'all. So we're going to get into the notes for topic 4.2. We're going to be looking at the causes and effects of exploration. So make sure that you have your guided notes and that you're ready to go. And let's get into your first learning objective for this section. So, your first learning objective for this topic, for this portion of Unit 4, is to really describe the role of states in the expansion of maritime exploration from 1450 to 1750. So, here we're looking specifically into not only maritime expansion in Europe, but how it specifically relates to state sponsorship. And again, just to reiterate, when we talk about states in this unit or in this class, we're not speaking about states like Texas or New Mexico or Arizona or anything like that. We're talking about countries. So we are discussing in this section state sponsored exploration in this topic. Maritime exploration had been happening for a long time before 1450 to 1750. We've talked a lot about that through units 1, unit 2, and so on, right? Exploration had been happening well before. But here in this time period, 1450 to 1750, is where countries, states, specifically the examples that we've given you thus far are countries like Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands, the Dutch. They actually pay people to take a fleet out and find new lands or trade routes. Christopher Columbus is another great example that we'll definitely talk about here as we go. So, here again, we're looking at particularly the role that countries have, states have in the expansion of maritime exploration. And before we get into specific efforts from specific countries to expand maritime exploration, it's really important that we understand how and why this new state sponsored era of exploration occurs in general. And again, we're talking about this period now that we're getting into is what we consider to be the age of exploration. These new ocean journeys are very dangerous, but you still have Europeans who want to take part in it, and we want to know why. And part of the things that we already know from topic 4.1 is that maritime tools were borrowed and adapted from other cultures, right? The compass, the lateen sail, etc. We've talked about all those yesterday and previously in 4.1. And those tools really enabled better navigation, more efficient ships, and so on. And um, here on this slide, you have an astrolabe, you have a magnetic compass, you also have a star chart, things like that. But the reasons why European states want to pursue maritime exploration is typically referred or reduced down to the three G's that we talked about: gold, glory, and God, right? Those are the three main reasons. Now, obviously, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of things inside of that and things to unpack and whatnot. And it could be a lot more detailed than that, but that is kind of where we will get our start with. Now, the quest for gold comes through something called mercantilism. You can see the term mercantilism there on your screen. I would highly encourage you to jot that jot that word down, on the right hand side of your notes where you have space for some vocabulary terms. Mercantilism, and then I would also encourage you to look it up, right, as well, so you can have a good, solid definition for that. Um, when we talk about gold, right, in some cases, yes, are there European countries and European explorers who are looking for physical, actual piles of gold and things like that? Yes, that is true. But when more specifically what we're speaking about when we talk about gold is we're looking at wealth, right? Um, New trade opportunities that are going to bring in gold and silver money into a country in order to increase its wealth. So it's not just um, physical gold or physical silver or anything like that, or physical tangible things. Sometimes it's um, the wealth itself. Maybe we find a new trade route that helps us find this material that other people want. We can sell it and that brings in money, right? So that's what we're talking about with that. Control over trade routes is a major motivator for states to sponsor expeditions to new places. And this is certainly the biggest reason that European states are all racing to try to find new trade routes through these exploration missions. You also have, of course, the religious motivation as well that plays a role in why Europeans want to set sail to new places. Part of their duty, or part of what they see as their duty as Christians to do, is to convert non believers, people who don't already believe in the Christian God, right? And these are typically going to be the conquered peoples. And this is something we'll certainly talk about some more when we get into Christopher Columbus and the Columbian Exchange. So, for the individuals that chose to undertake these things, right, this is where the third G comes into play, the glory. It's a risky voyage. People would know about it. So fame and glory and sometimes wealth and the connection that that brings for the individual as well as for the country itself, right? So for example, again, we'll talk about Christopher Columbus at some point. If he had found a true west, like a westward trade route to Asia, yeah, it certainly would have been something very significant for Spain. It still was a very significant thing for Spain, and we'll talk about that more. But it brought glory for Columbus and for Spain as a whole. Now, this is something that we talked about a little bit in 4.1. Um, One of the motivating factors for the Europeans to go out in search of new trade routes is particularly to Asia, right? Because again, the Europeans, until Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, they don't know that there's a whole other land out there. So they're trying to get to Asia. Um, and more specifically, they're trying to trade in spices. And that spice trade is really lucrative and is really um, important, right? And you have the Spice Islands that are a really coveted destination for sea merchants. But the problem with the route to Asia and Southeast Asia is that the Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean route, right, which you see on the map, is monopolized by Italy, right? Italy effectively controls all of the prices, all of the goods that entered into the rest of Europe. And then when Constantinople is captured by the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Turks in 1453, they gain a significant control over the Silk Roads. So Europeans have to pay high taxes to access overland trade. It's not that they couldn't trade over land anymore. It's not that they couldn't go through the Mediterranean Sea, but there was this competition. And this competition also, because they were controlled by the Ottomans, because they're controlled by the Italians, they're paying high taxes. So why would we pay them taxes is their thought process if we could just go and find a new route for ourselves. So these developments push Europeans to look for new trade routes, and explorers are going to head south, particularly the Portuguese who head south around Africa. We touched on them in 4.1, and then ultimately westward, right? The Spanish are kind of the first to start trying to think about pushing westward, going to the west to find a way around. And again, because they didn't know the Americas exist um, until Columbus sort of discovers them or happens upon them. But it was all about finding an alternate route to avoid paying taxes and kind of conquer this new trade route that you could control. Now, in this next section, we're going to look at specific states that engage in new transoceanic travel with a focus on the theme of economics. So, before we were starting to touch on governance, why do states invest in this exploration? Here, we're going to talk about the economic portion. So, you have the Portuguese development of maritime technology, the Spanish sponsorship of voyages of Columbus and subsequent voyages across the Pacific, and then, of course, Atlantic crossings undertaken by the then later the English, the French, the Dutch, etc., with the goal of finding alternative sailing routes to Asia. So we'll take a look at all of those here in this second section of the topic. And first among these European countries that we're going to talk about is Portugal. Portugal is located at the southwestern corner of what is called the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. It is, because it's along this coastline here, it is a prime candidate for exploration in a new direction, right? Because it is on the edge of Europe rather than on the Mediterranean Sea, right? It's not Spain with ports on the Mediterranean. It's not France with trying to get ports in the southern part of France, etc. So it doesn't depend on accessing the Mediterranean. It's on the end of Europe. It's facing outward. It's prime location for this ocean-facing nation. And so you can see it. It's circled here on this pink-ish colored map on the screen. But then you have a map published in 1570 on the screen. It's been sort of rotated so that it kind of lines up a little better with the map on the right. And you can notice at the very bottom there, that is a Portuguese caravel at the bottom of the map as well. So this will be the first country that we really explore and look into in some detail. And talking about Portugal, it would be, of course, impossible to not talk about Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator is the son of the Portuguese king, King John the First. He is credited with really kicking off or initiating this age of exploration. And again, age of exploration is really a Eurocentric term. It's really coming at you from the European perspective. It's also called the Age of Discovery because really it's when Europe sort of discovered new things, and then of course the rest of the world will discover things along with Europeans as well. But Henry is credited with the direction of developing the Portuguese caravel, which is the lightweight ship that we talked about in 4.1, which used the lateen sails. It's, of course, the small, quick, highly maneuverable ship that kick-started explorations for the Portuguese. At the age of 21, Henry helps his father capture a port in Morocco called Ceuta, which is home to Muslim pirates that frequently would raid or rob uh, ships on the Portuguese coast and raid the Portuguese coast itself. Um, so control over that port meant that Portugal could control all shipping in and out of the Strait of Gibraltar. Now, again, if you go back to that map of Europe, you have the Iberian Peninsula where Spain and Portugal kind of sit at the bottom there. Well, at the very tip of that map, right, is Gibraltar. And then right below that is Africa. So if you remember a map, you've got this really thin gap between Europe and Africa. That is the Strait of Gibraltar. So controlling Ceuta means that Portugal controls all shipping through the Strait of Gibraltar. Now, Henry would then go on to continue to explore just a bit. He's not like a quintessential explorer. He's for the most part not doing the exploration himself. He's mostly funding the explorations of particularly of the African coasts and particularly islands in the Atlantic, which we'll talk about here in just a bit. But it is his leadership and his direction that is the beginning of European expansion and European colonization through maritime exploration. So while he may not be necessarily full on an explorer himself, he's really credited with kickstarting that process. And then these are the islands that we are talking about, right? The island of Madeira. The Madeira is an island that's located kind of directly west of Morocco. So, sailing for Prince Henry the Navigator, you have two Portuguese captains, João Gonçalves Zarco and then Tristan Vaz Teixeira, who make landfall on what was an uninhabited island, right? An island that nobody lived on. And it was the first unknown land that they claimed on their own, right? It's Portugal's first territorial discovery was this island of Madeira. Um, so then Portuguese settlers would then start moving to Madeira. They would turn Madeira into this very profitable wheat and sugarcane farming production center, which would directly benefit the two captains that discovered Madeira and Prince Henry himself, who funded the mission. So the success of finding and discovering and claiming Madeira would encourage other people to then make discoveries and go off on their own. So this is kind of where we say that Prince Henry the Navigator really kicks off this age of exploration But again, it is also these two captains who make this discovery as well, Joao Gonçalves Zarco and Tristan Vaz Teixeira. They both really are all responsible for this as well. Portugal would also then later claim another set of islands, which were a little further out west than Madeira. And if we remember to a map I showed you in 4.1, when the Portuguese really start to discover ocean currents and then wind patterns and things like that, this really makes sense, right? Sailing south towards Africa, then over to the west just a bit until they picked up that northern current, which would then push them to the winds that would push them back towards Portugal. So it really makes sense that the next set of islands they discover is an archipelago called the Azores. The Azores, still inhabited, still claimed by Portugal. They would claim that and settle that island, those set of islands in 1427. The Azores are located about 750 miles off the coast of Portugal. So this really tells us, and this is where we start to really get this idea of how far the Portuguese sailed and when. So this tells us that the trips to the Azores are the farthest out onto the open at this point by 1427 for any European sailors, right? They're not along the coast. They're not along the coast of Africa, right? You see the Canary Islands there as well. You see Madeira and then the Azores. So we know up until this point, 1427, this is the farthest out that European sailors have gone. And that crew then we can assume is capable of a fairly long journey away from coastlines. So really important discovery and really sets us up to really understand how far the Portuguese have gotten. And the photo there on the lower right is just a picture of Madeira as well today, a modern day picture. And it's a very beautiful island, still claimed by Portugal, as are the Azores. So this is really what sets off this age of discovery for Portugal and then later Europe as a whole. Now, keep in mind that map previous where the Canary Islands were located as well, because that plays into this next slide here. So Prince Henry wants Portugal to really explore the coast of Africa for a few reasons. One, he's interested in circumventing and getting past the overland trade routes. And we talked about the two trade routes, the Silk Roads and the Trans Saharan trade routes. So here he's really interested in getting past the Trans Saharan trade routes in particular. And he also wants to find a good source of gold and slaves for Portugal to have direct access to, because, yes, the trans-Saharan trade routes were a good access point for slave labor, enslaved people, and for gold. That is part of what was traded in the trans-Saharan trade routes, along with salt and other things. Two, he wanted to know just how far south the Muslim territories really extended, right? Because again, Portugal up until this point really didn't have a ton of information about what lay south of the Saharan desert, right? So in 1433, you have Captain Gil Eanes, who is given a crew and a ship by Prince Henry in order to make a dangerous trip around what was called Cape Bojador, again in 1433. Now, the first time that Eanes would attempt this trip, and you can see Cape Bojador marked there on the map, not too far south of where um, Madeira is located. We can tell, though, that he was unsuccessful, right? There was a dangerous currents, dangerous winds and stuff. And he and the crew are blown westward off the coast of Africa and into the Canary Islands, right? And so they discover the Canary Islands. There are slaves there that are captured. And so Eanes brings them back and he's not returning empty handed. A year later, in 1434, he's given another ship for yet another round, a second attempt at rounding the Cape. And part of another thing that Prince Henry wanted to find out as well is there was a sort of story about this long lost Christian kingdom, which there's never ever any actual proof that this kingdom existed. But Prince Henry wanted to connect with that long lost Christian kingdom, right? So again, this is part of why wanting to know how far south the Muslim territories it really existed. But again, no real proof. But in 1434, Eanes is given another ship for another attempt at going around this cape. And this was a successful trip that opened the door for Portuguese exploration of African coasts. Um, so, again, once you think about it, looking at a map of Africa, what alternate route does being able to round this cape and figure out the coast of Africa, what does this open up for Portugal once they're able to get past Cape Bojador, right? So this will pave the way later for Vasco da Gama to discover the route around the Cape of Good Hope at the very southern tip of Africa. So this is really just setting the stage. We're starting this process that will eventually lead Portugal around the southern tip of Africa. And it takes two attempts really for Portugal to get around this southern tip of Africa. In 1488, you have Bartholomew Diaz, who is hired and commissioned by King John II of Portugal to find a new trade route by sailing around the southern tip of Africa. So this is roughly, 50 years after Eanes. Um, and so Bartholomew Diaz goes around Africa, finds this southern tip of Africa, and does actually sail around the Cape of Good Hope. He is successful in getting around the Cape in 1488, but he does not keep going, right? There bad weather, things of that. His crew, the ships themselves are in pretty rough shape. So when he turns around, he is on the eastern side of what we now would say is South Africa, right? The country of South Africa. And one of the things that really made the voyage successful, even though he didn't ultimately find the trade route to India, was the fact that his ship left the coastline, kind of swung themselves out into open waters before going around the Cape at the western edge of Africa, Cape Bojador. Right, you'll notice on the map, it's not he didn't go along the entirety of the coastline of Africa. He stayed well off the coast. This portion of Africa, right, is known for its poor weather, currents, etc. Had he stayed along the entire coast of Africa, he probably would not have made it. Right, the waters there are very bad. But you can see on the map, took a route further out into the ocean, and that's what helped him round off and find the Cape of Good Hope and make it to the eastern side. And then it's 10 years later that you have Vasco da Gama, right? Which is another Portuguese explorer. Vasco da Gama becomes the first European to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, reach India, which was the ultimate goal for Portugal, to ultimately find a new trade route to India and then connect with Southeast Asia. So this new route to Asia opens up Portugal to become a colonial empire in Africa. And it is ultimately the beginning of a new age, the age of imperialism, which we will get to imperialism later on in the course. But this is what really sets that stage for Portugal to be participants in that. Now, what all this increase in maritime travel that the Portuguese are able to successfully engage in leads Portugal to build what's called a trading post empire. So rather than conquering a huge territory, setting up a large, empire, things like that, think of like uh, the Mongol Empire, for example, like a huge territory. Instead of conquering a huge territory, what the Portuguese would do is they would establish like a small fort or a small location, like a small settlement, in an effort to really sort of like claim a spot and kind of dominate the trade routes that exist around that spot, right? Um, some of Portugal's trading posts are here on the map. So you have one on the western coast of Africa in what is Sierra Leone. You have one in Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East, one in Goa, Macau, Malacca, for example. Malacca, of course, is one that we've talked about before, Malacca. Um, those two spots, Hormuz and Malacca in particular, gave Portugal really control over those straits. There's a strait in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, and then the Strait of Malacca that we've talked about before, um, where ships that are carrying goods had to pass. So we've talked about that earlier in the coast, in particular, when we talked about the Chola dynasty. and the Srivijaya Empire, right, surrounding the Strait of Malacca for this very same reason, to control trade. We'll talk more about trading posts later on and in more detail, particularly in topic 4.4 when we talk about establishing maritime empires. So we will definitely give you some more detail on this topic. And then comes Christopher Columbus. Now, if we remember, Spain is a little bit behind the game. It's a little bit behind Portugal in maritime exploration. And you want to remember why. We talked about the Reconquista, right? Spain pushing the Moors, pushing the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula, recapturing territory from the Moors, which ends in 1492. So this whole time, while Portugal is really exploring around Africa, solidifying control of a trade route all the way to Southeast Asia, Spain is not participating in the game. So by 1492, they start to think about where do we go, right? Maybe we should go west. And again, remember, this is because there was an understanding that the world was round, right? Sort of. Um, so the assumption was if you sailed west, you would just sort of make it all the way around. Nobody had done it before, so nobody really knew what was out there. But if you sailed west, you should eventually make it to the eastern part of the map. Um, so that was the thought process. And um, Spain really starts to figure out who can we go to, who can we find to do this. And it's Christopher Columbus, right? Christopher Columbus is an Italian who had come up with a plan to find Asia and Southeast Asia by sailing west from Europe across what was at the time called the Ocean Sea, right? Because again, nobody really knew what was out there. It was thought to just be a really giant ocean. And so in 1492, excuse me, in 1484, Columbus first takes his proposal to King John II of Portugal, and King John is like, I don't really need this, right? Vasco da Gama is about to discover this route around Africa. I think I'm fine. In 1486, Columbus takes his plan to Queen Isabella of Spain, but she denies it for the same reason that King John II rejects his plan. They estimated that the distance that would be required to travel was just too far, right? It was just too much. Um, and really, Columbus they thought, was like like lowballing what he thought he had to travel. So they were like, there's no way it's that short of a distance. So again, he goes back to Portugal, tries again to convince Portugal to sponsor him in 1488. But again, as we know, Bartholomew Diaz had just successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and then later would find Vasco da Gama in 1498. So Portugal really didn't feel the need to really find another route. They said, we're pretty close. We've found Southern Africa. We've found the Cape of Good Hope. We're fine. So then it's January of 1492 that the Spanish court again hears from Christopher Columbus and rejected his proposal again. But it was King Ferdinand, right, who really was scared that Christopher Columbus would gain sponsorship from his voyage from an enemy of Spain. So Columbus finally gets the green light from Spain for this mission. It's Ferdinand and Isabella who decide to finally sponsor him, just in case, basically. They really weren't confident that Christopher Columbus would return. They figured he would die, really. So the terms that they gave him were really generous compared to other exploration voyages, right? They gave him a lot of money and a lot of leeway, and said, if you find your way back, like, you get a lot out of this, because they thought, well, this guy's going to die. He's not going to make it back. So what's the point? And he does eventually, and we'll talk more about that. Now, I'm sure someone will probably correct my pronunciation of this German, but Erdapfel is German for Earth Apple, which is the name of the oldest surviving globe model of the world, which is what you see on the screen here. It's produced in around the 1490s, so just before Columbus's voyage to the Americas, which is why the Americas are completely missing, right? So you can kind of see a projection of that map here as well on the screen. Notice there's no America. You can see Cabo Verde, you can see the Azores, you can see Spain and parts of Africa. You can see all that. And then on the other side, you just see Japan and parts of China. So the Americas are completely missing. So it's a good point here to make that people in this period did not think that the earth was flat, right? You can get that sense. There are probably still people, right, who do think that is. But it was the most prominent thinkers from the ancient Greeks and the Romans to the medieval period in Europe had really understood and come to understand that the earth was round, right? There was a spherical notion of the world. And you can see that here in this map and in this model. So we had that option, we had that understanding, right? So again, the photo on the left is the actual Edipfel globe, right? And the map on the right is kind of that modern representation of the side of the globe, which was just one large ocean, the ocean sea, if you will. So that's where the Americas should be. But nobody knew about it because nobody had seen it before. So the assumption was that if you just sailed around, you would get to the other side. And so this is where Columbus's estimation, like when you look at the map, you think like, well, it's not that far to go, really. But since nobody had ever done it before, there was a thought that he was underestimating just how far this distance was. And sure, he definitely was underestimating that distance because the Americas are there. Nobody had known about it. And it's really hard to really make out in a lot of detail here in this picture. But this is a picture of one of the actual world maps that Christopher Columbus would probably have studied when he was planning his westward trip to Asia from Europe. The map is produced by Henricus Martellus, a German cartographer, and was really lost to historians until the 1960s when it was anonymously donated to Yale University. Now, using some high tech imaging software and really special photography methods, they slowly were able to reveal some of the detail. And it's really different than any modern map that we would have seen, right? The continents of Africa are there. You can sort of make out Europe there in the upper left hand corner ish of that. You can make out, again, Africa and parts of Asia. But again, this would be the map, a very similar map, if not this map in particular, that would have been used by Columbus. Again, notice there's no Americas on there, right? So again, the assumption was to just sail west, and if you sail west far enough, you'll get to Asia, right? So this is where we kind of see both of those play together in this idea. Now, by agreeing to sponsor Columbus's voyage to find this new route to Asia, Spain officially enters the age of exploration alongside Portugal. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella only approved the voyage out of concern that Columbus would find someone else to sponsor him. They really did not expect Columbus to make it to Asia because, again, his calculations of the distance were repeatedly and heavily underestimated. But Spain wanted to kind of get as much reward of the discovery of any new land or new routes, new anything. So Columbus was given 3 ships and crew to really undertake the journey. He was promised, grand titles, fame, fortune, and 10% of the cut of any revenue that was generated from his endeavors, which is really generous at the time. And he was promised to be made viceroy, which is like essentially like a governor, if you will, of any newly colonized territory. He's about to discover an entire continent, basically, even though he doesn't technically ever really discover the Americas as a whole, like America in general, or even really South America that much. But he discovers and helps discover a huge set of new territory that nobody had ever seen before. So this was a really lucrative deal for him. But again, they really did it to sort of so that no one else would do it. And they didn't think that they would ever really need to pay him because they thought he was not going to make it back. Now, despite both Portugal and Spain being super reluctant to really give any money to fund the voyages of Christopher Columbus to find this westward route to Asia, his first trip, which is, and I know this map gets a little bit challenging to see, his first trip is marked off in pink on this map. they actually proved to be really fruitful. And you can see he barely in 1502 and maybe a little bit in 1498 even finds the continent of the Americas. He really just finds, Hispaniola, Cuba, and like Puerto Rico. But um, his trips to the New World are extremely lucrative and extremely successful for Spain. These voyages dramatically increase European interest in transoceanic travel, transoceanic trade. We are going to spend some more time looking on the effects of Christopher Columbus and his voyages to the New World later in the unit in 4.3. So stay tuned for that. But here you've got four trips, one in 1492, one again in 1493, because he comes back with some good stuff in 1492. So they send him back right away. And then again in 1498 and 1502. So again, we'll talk more about Columbus, but makes four journeys to the quote unquote new world that he discovered. And again, we'll spend some more time on that in the next section. So these next two slides are a bit of independent practice for you. This is an excerpt. It is a primary document because it is from the person who lived the moment. It is a letter from Christopher Columbus to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella that he wrote in 1493 after he came back to Spain. He describes the inhabitants of this new place called Hispania, which would later become Hispaniola. It is one of the islands that he first explored in the Caribbean on his first voyage to the New World. So, what I want you to do is follow along, and as I read this for you, and then spend some time answering the questions that are in your guided notes. So, let's read. They are by nature fearful and timid, but when they see that they are safe and all fear is banished, they are very guileless and honest, and very liberal of all they have. And I gave them many beautiful and pleasing things which I had brought with me, for no return whatever, in order to win their affection, and that they might become Christians, and inclined to love our king and queen and princes and all the people of Spain, and that they might be eager to search for and gather and give to us what they abound in, and we greatly need. They do not practice idolatry. On the contrary, they believe that all strength, all power, in short, all blessings are from heaven. And I have come down from there with these ships and sailors, and in this spirit was I received everywhere after they had gotten over their fear. So take a moment. You have two questions here. What does Columbus's choice of language tell us about his attitude of the people that he meets? How does he describe himself in relation to these people? And what reasons would you believe that Columbus is being genuine in his descriptions? So, what reasons would you think that he might need to embellish or go above and beyond those descriptions? So, take a few minutes and practice. Now, we briefly spoke about Magellan in topic 4.1. And again, Magellan is most famously known as the first person to circumnavigate the globe. Now, take that with a little bit of an asterisk, right? The trip, the voyage that he started, does in fact make it all the way around the world. Magellan himself does not. He died somewhere in the Philippines. So he himself never really made it back to Spain. The only thing that does is one ship, one single ship, and 18 men made it back to Spain under Captain Juan Sebastian Elcano. When Magellan was initially proposing this idea of circumnavigating the globe, circumnavigating the world, the Portuguese king, King Manuel, rejected him several times. So Magellan renounces his citizenship, renounces his Portuguese nationality, and he takes his request to the king in Spain, King Charles I, right? Because again, he wants to circumnavigate the globe. He thinks he can find this route that Christopher Columbus had started. So King Charles approves the funding of the exploration, and Magellan sailed for Spain as a Spaniard despite being Portuguese and having really also completed a lot of voyages for the Portuguese. Um, left Spain in 1519. So this is where this idea of circumnavigation really came from. He had seen Christopher Columbus do it. He had heard of Christopher Columbus doing it. Tries to convince the Portuguese to undertake this task themselves. They don't want to. Spain had already done it. Spain knew it was successful to go west to find something, and Magellan thinks he can finally find Asia and make it all the way around the world. He does kind of. We'll talk more about that. Now, here's another moment for you to practice some independent practice. This is an excerpt from a letter to the Cardinal of Salzburg in 1522 from Maximilianus, detailing the events of the voyage of Magellan through interviews with the surviving crew. So, this is a bit of a primary document because it's a letter that's written, but it's also a bit of a secondary document as well because this is someone who interviewed the crew members. So this letter is written from the interviews with the survivors, not from someone from who was on the ship itself, but it is taken immediately after the survivors returned to Spain. So again, I'll read this excerpt with you. So follow along and then take a moment, pause, and answer the questions. Um, from this island, they sailed to Subuth, or Cebu. Magellan, having noticed in the chief's house a sick person in very wasted condition, asked who he was and what disease he was suffering. He was told that it was the chief's grandson and that he had been suffering from 2 years from a violent fever. Magellan exhorted him to be of good courage, that if he would devote himself to Christ, he would immediately recover his former health and strength. The Indian consented and adored the cross, and received baptism, and the next day declared that he was well again, rose from his bed, and walked about, and took his meals like the others. What visions he may have told his friends, I cannot say, but the chief and over 2,200 Indians were baptized and professed the name and faith of Christ. So, why was this detailed account of conversion of the chief's grandson written? To whom was it written? And what would it tell us about the potential motives for European exploration? Take a moment to answer those questions. Now, here what we see is a map from 1561. It is a map of the Americas. And on here, you see labeled Frenum Magellani, or the Strait of Magellan. The Strait of Magellan is a sea route located in modern day Chile that Magellan used to sail around the southern tip of South America on his expedition to circumnavigate the globe. So this map was created well after Magellan's voyage, right? Magellan's folks come back in the 1720, or excuse me, the 1520s, but it is an interesting view of how those in the mid 1500s really thought of the Americas. So when you look at this map, you might notice that, and we've seen this map a bit before at the beginning of the class, the beginning of the semester. Japan is labeled as Zipanju. It's square, it's large, and it's actually really close to Mexico. Brazil is marked by this depiction of cannibals. North America is really oddly shaped, with most of Canada actually missing. So just keep in mind, they were still trying to figure out what this landmass was. They didn't really have a full view of what this landmass was. So this map is the best representation they could make at the time with the information that they had. And this map here is really just a great reference point for some of the general routes of the major European expeditions during the entirety of the Age of Exploration. Magellan's full route is marked out in light blue. Again, remember, this is really just general. Nobody was there. There was no GPS. We didn't have like a tracker on these folks. So they're really general as a whole. They don't show exact routes or stopping points, but you can kind of see as you get to the southern tip of South America, you have this little jaunt through this little territory, the Strait of Magellan, then taking that route all the way across the Pacific Ocean up into the Philippines, which is where Magellan dies, and then making their way back through the Indian Ocean around Africa and up to Portugal. But you can see the routes of Columbus, Caboto, Cartier, Vasco da Gama, etc. And then you can start to see the possessions, the territories that each country takes, and look at the difference between the territories that Spain claims, right? Larger territories versus the territory that's claimed by Portugal. In a lot of cases, Portugal's really claiming small segments, small forts, the trading post empire as we talked about. But again, this is really just a generalized map to show you kind of the various the routes that were taken by both the Portuguese and the Spanish. And let's not mistake, the first few voyages to this quote unquote new world that we call it now, and we will call it the new world versus the old world because new, it's new to the Spanish and it's new to the Europeans. The first several voyages to this new world don't really bring the wealth and the riches and the gold that the Spanish had hoped for. But that does change when the Spanish encounter the native populations and civilizations in Mesoamerica, particularly the Aztecs in Mexico and the Tainos in Cuba. Hernan Cortes is perhaps one of the most infamous Spanish conquistadors of the time period and the region. He spends time in Cuba from 1511 to 1519, where he managed encomiendas. We'll talk about encomiendas in 4.4, which are really plots of land that are worked by non Christian natives that are enslaved. Again, we'll talk more about that in 4.4. But the enslavement of natives who are then forced to work is one of the major sources of wealth for the Spanish in the New World. After Cortez spends time in Cuba, he's put in charge of a Spanish expedition into the interior of Mexico for the purpose of colonizing Mexico. It's in 1519 um, when Cortez begins claiming territory in Mexico for the Spanish crown, and in 1519 and 1520 is when he encounters the Aztecs. And it was less than 3 years from then. So again, we're looking at like 1519, 1520. By 1522, 1523, Cortez and his army destroy and topple the Aztec Empire, right? And we talked about the Aztec Empire in 1.4, right? The Aztecs had been known for their use of precious metals, including gold and silver. So this is a really quick overview of what Cortez did in the New World. But the main point here is that native slave labor, along with gold and other precious metals, are really the major economic factors for the Spanish and the Europeans continuing to explore the New World, right? The more that this gets out there, that there is this wealth, this riches, and the slave labor, and etc., this is the motivating factor for Spain and the Europeans. We'll talk a little bit more about these as we go, especially as we talk about the Columbian Exchange and then what follows after. So we'll dive into this in some more detail then. That brings us to John Cabot, who was an Italian explorer who actually is named Giovanni Caboto. He left Italy and looked to King Henry VII of England for financing for a voyage to find what would become known as a Northwest Passage to Asia. Now, he doesn't succeed in finding a new route to Asia, but he does claim land in Canada for Britain. And he establishes a much shorter northerly route from Europe to North America. And it takes Britain over 100 years since Cabot goes in 1497 to North America to establish their first North American settlement in Jamestown in North America. So Jamestown happens, after 1597. So it'll be a while before the British come, but they were still kicking around a little bit with John Cabot here in 1497. So we'll talk more about the Northwest Passage as well. The French also take a look at that. So let's talk about that a little bit more as well. So John Cabot is claiming land in Canada, what is today Canada, for Great Britain, for the British, and so are the French. And so if you think about how this influences the world as we know it today Canada is part of, well, not part of Great Britain. It is its own country, but it was a part of the British Empire for quite a long time. And in fact, today, the head of state, the monarch of Canada, is actually the English king, the British king, King Charles III. And Canada also speaks, a significant portion of Canada Montreal, and Quebec speak French. And that's part of this slide here, the French exploration for the Northwest Passage. So France also sponsors expeditions with the intent of finding an alternate route to Asia, just like Spain, just like England, etc. But they also want to find this northern passage, this Northwest Passage. So once Christopher Columbus and his voyages reveal that there is some sort of landmass in the ocean, right? They're trying to find a way to go around whatever that landmass in the middle is. So France is trying to find a way around North America, just like the British were as well in 1597. So you have Jacques Cartier, yes, of the Cartier family, yes, of the Cartier brand. He embarked on a mission to find this passage in 1534, but he is unsuccessful. Instead, he discovers that there is land with natural resources in the parts of Canada that he explored that could be very valuable to France, particularly fur. Now, Cartier completed 3 different voyages to Canada, and the goal of finding this passage to Asia was completely abandoned. And later, you have Samuel de Champlain, who also embarks on several voyages to the region. He eventually founds and starts up Quebec, and French settlements in the New World start as well. So again, thinking all the way to the current day, Quebec is a French-speaking territory of Canada, a French-speaking province of Canada, and this is exactly why. The Dutch also try to get into this game as well. The quest for the Northwest Passage continues under the Dutch as well, who sponsored Henry Hudson. Now, again, he too, and you can tell why. Look at where he goes in 1609 and 1610. You're not finding a Northwest Passage around this territory. But Henry Hudson explores parts of what is today Canada and the United States. The Hudson Bay, which is the endpoint of the purple line on the map in northern Canada, uh, is named for Henry Hudson, Hudson Bay. Then the Hudson River, which comes from the Hudson Bay down to this area where the pink line is, where New York City is today, is also named after Henry Hudson. Right. And he sailed this river in 1609, and he claimed this river valley in what is now New York City for the Dutch. So the Dutch established a colony here called New Amsterdam in present day, where present day New York City is. Again, New Amsterdam is a Dutch, Amsterdam is in the Netherlands. And then this territory would later be claimed by the British after a war. And this is where it gets its name, New York. York is a city in England, for example. So just keep that in mind. This is where these places get their names. And it's Henry Hudson who really discovers this region. And this slide here, you don't need to know this for the exam. It is really just a fun fact, a little bit of a follow-up fact of the English, the French, and the Dutch trying to find this Northwest Passage to Asia. For this entire time period, 1450 to the 1750 period, no explorer is able to successfully locate a northern passage to Asia. It's not until 1850 that an Irish explorer by the name of Robert McClure locates a passage, but it requires crossing over ice because it is very cold and frozen up there. So no one really completes this journey by ship until the 1900s. The waters are simply too frozen for ships to pass without icebreakers, which were a much more recent maritime invention. So it's the 1900s. Again, you don't need to know that for the exam. It's really just a fun fact for you. And then this slide as well is really just to sort of recap what we've talked about thus far. These are the states in Europe that sponsored exploration with the initial goal of trying to find an alternate route to Asia from Europe. Only 2 are successful, and that's Portugal and Spain, right? Portugal finds a route around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. Spain finds it with the route that Magellan takes through the Straits of Magellan in southern Chile around South America. So only two countries are successful at finding a new route to Asia. Um, England doesn't find it going through the Northwest Passage. France doesn't find it, although Cartier and Champlain, they find territory in Canada that's very successful for them. And then the Dutch don't find it either with Henry Hudson and the Northwest Passage in North America. But all of this exploration, Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, it will all result in colonization and settlements around the world for the Europeans. And that's something that we'll talk about more in this unit. And then as we get into unit 5 as well, we'll definitely talk about colonization in more detail. But again, just to sort of recap everything we've talked about thus far, this gives you that idea that only Portugal and Spain are successful at finding an alternate route to Asia. Now, lastly, all of the state sponsored expeditions that we've talked about from Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, all of that state sponsored expeditions are fundamentally tied back to an economic system known as mercantilism. If you didn't get to jot down a definition of that here or earlier when we discussed it, the definition is here in slide 31. Um, in order for a particular state to really increase its wealth, which is measured in gold or other precious metals, they had to find ways to increase the amount of gold that was flowing into their state. By and large, this is done through trade, right? The more that you can sell, the more money you can bring in, right? So when a state can export more than they have to import, their wealth increases. And this is what fuels exploration. And it's why these alternative new routes to Asia were so important for Portugal, for Spain, for England, France, and the Dutch. It was so important for them to find it. Mercantilism is also responsible for the competition between these states to claim the new trade routes, establish trading posts, and then later colonize these new territories. Now, again, new, and again, calling it the New World as well, because it's new to the Europeans, right? So, this is where this concept of New World versus Old World comes in. They're not new. We've already talked about this territory in the Americas. We talked about that in 1.4. But these colonies are going to supply cheap labor, most of the time slave labor, and cheap raw materials. Again, often through the use of slave labor. The state, the mercantilist state, whether it be France, Spain, Portugal, etc., would then bring that, import that, bring that back from their colonies, make stuff with it, and then sell that, export that at very high prices. So any state that could claim trade routes or new colonies would find themselves a very reliable supply of wealth. So what you see on the slide is a very simplified version of that, of how a mercantilist state gains wealth through its colonies and its control of trade. A colony would not be allowed to trade freely. This is what will set us up later for revolutions, right? When we get to Unit 5. Colonies could not trade freely. For example, colonies in the Americas could not trade freely with others. They had to trade with Britain. That's just one example. So this created a very cheap and exclusive supply of raw materials and labor from the controlling state. And then that controlling state could then sell the manufactured finished goods back to these colonies as well. So you should be very familiar with this term. This term is something that you need to remember. Mercantilism is super important. It's probably one of the most important ideas out of Unit 4 as a whole. And you should be able to explain how it is a leading cause of exploration in this time period. So I really can't stress that enough, how important the idea of mercantilism is. It's something we will talk about over and over and over again in this unit. So to wrap up 4.2, the major difference in exploration in this period versus other periods is state-sponsored exploration. Countries sponsor exploration. Countries are paying explorers to go. We've seen exploration before, we've seen it, etc. The difference here is it's sponsored by countries, by kingdoms, by monarchs. Portugal finds a new route sailing around Africa. They establish trading posts in Africa and India and other parts in Asia. Spain finds a new route to Asia by sailing around the southern tip of South America. Spain begins colonizing the Americas, which we will talk about more in detail later. But you also have England, France, and the Netherlands failing to find their own alternative route through the Northwest Passage, but they do begin claiming and colonizing lands in North America. And again, remembering the motivating factors: gold, God, and glory. Gold meaning mercantilism. Mercantilism is super important, being the primary factor here. Gold, money, wealth, mercantilism. That is the most important motivating factor.